realised that I don't know how to spell university, but anyway, not to worry. If there's an editing error somewhere. Anyway, if my head suddenly disappears while I'm talking, it's because I've sat down, and that's normal. The research I'm reporting on is part of the Oceanic Lexicon project at the Australian National University, and the project's goal is to reconstruct as much as we can of the lexicon, the vocabulary of Proto-Oceanic, and by doing this to gain greater insight into the culture of Proto-Oceanic speakers. Proto-Oceanic, of course, was the language ancestral to all of today's Oceanic languages. Today, the languages cover a vast area of the Pacific, but Proto-Oceanic itself, spoken sometime around 1300 BC, was originally spoken in the Bismarck archipelago to the east of New Guinea. It was associated with the Lapita culture, and the tiny triangles mark early Lapita sites. Proto-Oceanic speakers spread very rapidly into the Pacific, and the dates on this slide are, of course, those provided by archaeologists. The Oceanic Lexicon Project was the brainchild of the next speaker, whose picture you see there, Andy Pawley, and its goal is to reconstruct as much Proto-Oceanic vocabulary as we can. Most of the work has been carried out by Andy, Meredith Osmond, and myself. We use a two-pronged approach to reconstruction. First, we hypothesize a Proto-Oceanic terminology on the basis of present-day Oceanic terminologies. For example, a set of terms for parts of the canoe. Then we search for cognate sets in order to reconstruct forms matching each meaning in that terminology. So far, 5 volumes have been published, all available online. All of them deal to some degree with semantic structures in speakers' minds, something that archaeology, of course, can't access. They include the taxonomies of plants and animals, classifying people by age cohorts, metaphors that are based on body parts, and so on. But volume 6, which we're working on now, delves further into structures of the mind. We look at the Proto-Oceanic conception of the seasons, at kinship and chieftainship structures, at magic and the supernatural. All of this done with... All of this done with a little bit of help from our friends. Some of them sadly no longer with us, and I owe an apology to Ross Clark, whose picture I couldn't find on the internet at the last minute. One of my tasks recently has been to reconstruct numeral systems and their uses, and I finished off writing, somewhat to my own surprise, about 150 pages. So this will be a very sketchy summary of a few bits of what I think I've found. This machine seems to have a life of its own. That's where I want to be. Here's the basic paradigm of Proto-Oceanic numerals. We can be reasonably convinced that this is correct because it's supported by both external and internal evidence. External evidence, that is evidence from Austronesian languages outside Oceanic, allows us to reconstruct numerals in Proto-Malayo-Polynesian, the ancestor of Proto-Oceanic, shown here with one of its descendants, the Philippine language Tagalog. Internal evidence, that is evidence from Oceanic languages, shows that the Proto-Oceanic numeral system was a direct descendant of the Proto-Malayo-Polynesian system. Musau and Samoan, here on the screen, from mutually distant parts of Oceanic, both clearly show the same Proto-Oceanic forms, or they both clearly reflect the same Proto-Oceanic forms. The forms in... Now I see what's going wrong. The forms in red at the bottom there are irregular in various ways, but time doesn't allow me to talk about them, I'm afraid. The reconstructible Proto-Oceanic system only counts to Saratus. Here we are, to Saratus 100, but many traditional Oceanic decimal systems counted to much higher powers of 10, as these examples show. It seems likely that Proto-Oceanic also had much higher numerals than 100, but that these have been replaced at different times and places because they were used rarely and were thus forgotten. one can reasonably ask, what were these numerals for? Why did Oceanic speakers need a complex decimal system? And the answer seems to be that they were used in ceremonial exchanges, mainly for food. There are a number of accounts of feasts which had the function of either cementing relationships or increasing the feast giver's status, and references to these are on the screen. In most cases, the number of food and other items was huge, and they were carefully counted as part of the process of exchange or status increase. This seems to have been the main use of higher numbers in decimal systems. There's quite a lot of evidence that in everyday counting, at least some early Oceanic communities used digit tallying. In other words, they counted on their fingers and their toes. Digit tallying has left its mark on some Oceanic numeral systems in two areas. One is New Guinea, the other Vanuatu and New Caledonia. This is an odd geographic distribution because it misses out, for example, the Solomon Islands, not to mention the rest of the Pacific. And I'll return to this in a moment. A pure tally-based system is one with bases 5 and 20. This example is taken from Mangapambula, spoken on Umboy Island between mainland New Guinea and New Britain. And the cycles of 5 are, I hope, obvious from the numerals in red. The base 5 reflects the use of a hand, and the numeral 5 usually means hand. Here, lamata means one hand, or 5. Lamaru means two hands, or 10, in Mangapambula. Lamaromata is apparently derived from two hands and one, presumably originally meaning two hands and 1 foot, for 15. The base 20 reflects the number of fingers and toes that a person has, and 20 is thus often expressed by the word for person. In this case, tomota, 20, is derived from tomotata, one man, and tomtoru, 40, means two men. There are three main varieties of tally-based numeral systems in Oceanic languages. The first is base 520, like Mangapambula, which we've just seen. The second is base 51020, which appears to be derived from a base 520 system, either hybridized by insertion of a term for 10 borrowed from a decimal system, or in New Caledonia by the loss of a 3 hands term for 15, and I will come back to this later. And the third kind of tally system is base 510, derived from a decimal system by chopping 1 to 10 into 2 cycles of 5, representing 2 hands. The base 51020 system on screen is Tuam, a language quite close geographically to Mangapambula. As I just mentioned, such a system is a hybrid of two kinds of system. One is a base 520 system. Notice that tamot, 20, is again the term for man. And the other is a decimal system with, in this case, sangavul, 10, reflecting the Proto-Oceanic term for 10, sangapulu. This hybridization would have occurred in communities where a decimal and a base 520 system, in other words, a decimal and a finger tallying system, were both in use at the same time. The third type of tally-based system is base 510. This is an example from central Vanuatu, and it's fairly obvious that this is a decimal system in which the first 10 cycle has been chopped into 2 5 cycles representing 2 hands. The Dakaka system has quite a complex history, with Sungavi 10 abbreviated to Ung from 20 upwards, and various phonological changes which I don't want to discuss now. Nonetheless, the numerals 6, 7, and 8 each contain an abbreviation of Lima, 5, abbreviated to Mi. The abbreviations in red reflect Proto-Oceanic Lima Lapi, 5, carry, where the reflex of Lapi, carry, functions as a ligature, a morpheme joining 2 numerals. For example, Milipsi, 8, reflects Proto-Oceanic Lima Lapi Tolu. That may sound like a large leap, but if one looks at the historical phonology, it works. 5 carry 3 or 5 plus 3. It's instructive to map the types of numeral systems. This map shows 11 types, but I'll limit myself to the 4 types that I've just discussed. The blue blobs represent decimal systems. They cover all of Oceanic except the 2 areas I've mentioned, New Guinea and the Bismarck Archipelago. New Guinea and the Bismarck Archipelago is the first area, and the Reef Santa Cruz Islands, Vanuatu and New Caledonia, or Southern Oceanic for short, is the second of the areas in which we find tally-based systems. Base 520 systems are shown in red. They cluster in parts of New Guinea and in New Caledonia. Roughly the same is true of base 51020, which are shown in dark green. They cluster in much of the same places as base 520 systems, supporting the claim that 51020 systems are hybridized from 520. Base 510 systems are shown in purple. I claimed just now that they're probably derived from decimal systems, and if you look carefully, and I'm not going to give you much time to do that, I'm afraid, you will see that purple 510 blobs are found usually close to blue decimal blobs, indicating that the 510 systems are derived from plain decimal systems. What sort of history has led to this distribution? Oceanic languages in New Guinea have long been in contact with Papuan languages, and a 2018 book by Owens and Lean on numerals in the Pacific shows that plenty of Papuan languages have tally-based systems, so it would not be surprising if Papuan tally-based systems have been calqued into Oceanic languages in New Guinea. The puzzle is the other region, Southern Oceanic, which shows no evidence for a Papuan presence. So, no linguistic evidence, at least, for a Papuan presence. This has led to considerable controversy, which some of you will be familiar with, I think. In 2005, Bob Blust proposed that the people of Vanuatu and New Caledonia, all Oceanic speaking, display several linguistic, cultural and genetically based features typical of people in New Guinea. He thought this indicated that Papuan speakers had been in Vanuatu and New Caledonia before Oceanic speakers arrived, despite the fact, as he admitted, that there was no archaeological evidence to support this. One of his linguistic features was the presence of numeral systems with base 5 and with person as the term for 20. In the following year, Andy Pawley published a wide-ranging paper which, among other things, argues that Blust's arguments weren't so strong after all, and suggested that there might be reason to think that Papuan speakers had accompanied Oceanic speakers on their voyage from New Guinea or from New Britain to Vanuatu. Donoghue and Denham in 2008 added phonological features to Blust's lists and reiterated his position. But in an addendum to their short paper, Blust suggested that Papuan speakers who had adopted key elements of Proto-Oceanic culture arrived in Vanuatu shortly after the first wave of Oceanic speakers. The matter then lay dormant for almost 10 years until 2018, when 2 archaeogenetics papers presented data indicating that Vanuatu had at least 2 waves of settlement. The initial settlement was by people genetically similar to Polynesians. 500 years or so later, there were further settlements, this time by people who were genetically more similar to the inhabitants of New Britain. Post and his comments and his colleagues comment, the almost complete replacement of a population's genetic ancestry that leaves the original languages in situ is extremely rare, possibly without precedent in human history, possibly without precedent in human history, and requires explanation. An explanation that seems to me to be quite plausible goes like this. Sometime around 1350, Austronesian speakers arrive in the Bismarcks. Over the next 250 years, their language evolves into Proto-Oceanic and the Lapita culture emerges. Around 1100 BC, Lapita people speaking an early Oceanic language and genetically similar to today's Polynesians settle in Vanuatu. Meanwhile, back in the Bismarcks, genetics tells us that Oceanic speakers, mainly women, are marrying Papuan-speaking men, and I infer that these men adopt their wives' language and culture. 500 years later, equipped with Lapita-style ocean-going canoes, some of the descendants of these folk from New Britain, now genetically more like Melanesians of New Britain, follow their ancestors to Vanuatu. They speak an Oceanic language with Papuan features, one of which was a tally-based numeral system. And this is a scenario which I would assume was repeated several times. This explanation is also reached independently by geneticist Murray Cox, one of the et al. In Bedford et al. At the bottom of this screen. This is a set of commentaries edited by Stuart Bedford on the two archaeogenetics papers, which are listed immediately above it. There is, happily, one piece of formal linguistic evidence for this Vanuatu-New Britain connection. Lynch 2009 shows that a fair number of Vanuatu languages reflect Proto-Oceanic Lapi, Kari, as their ligature. The same ligature is reflected in Tungak of North New Ireland and in Vinitri and Tolai of Eastern New Britain. In both locations, some languages lose or abbreviate the numeral lima, 5, leaving the ligature as the first element of the numerals 6 to 9. Unfortunately, all of this could have happened independently at different locations, so it might be a shared innovation, but it's uncertain. This leaves us with one small puzzle, the difference between Vanuatu and New Caledonia. Vanuatu has mainly base 510 systems with some decimal as well, whereas New Caledonia has a mixture of 520 and 51020 systems. However, we can account for the New Caledonian systems, and we can trace their origins to central Vanuatu. The northernmost language of New Caledonia is Belep. It has a base 520 system, and just a small part of that is shown on the screen. The phonological changes that have affected New Caledonian languages are complex, but we can etymologize the simple numerals 2, 3, and 5, as I've done there. And we can also etymologize the numerals 10 and 15 as 2 times 5 and 3 times 5. So far, so good. Not far to the south of Belep is Nelemwa. It's closely related to Belep, but it has a base 5-10-20 system. We might expect that it got to this point by inserting a term for 10 from the decimal system, but it clearly hasn't, because it has the same term for 10 as Belep does. The terms in both languages are, in the two languages, are cognate. Instead, the relatively simple term for 15 in Belep, 3 times 5, has been replaced in Nelemwa by a complex term meaning 10 and on top of it 5. The Nelemwa numerals from 16 to 19 follow the same pattern. The result is that the numerals from 11 to 19 now follow a base 10 system. This exemplifies how New Caledonia comes to have base 5-10-20 systems. They originate in a base 520 system by the loss of a 3 times 5 term for 15. The form for 10 in both languages reflects Proto-Oceanic Rua Lima, 2 times 5. This map shows the distribution of terms for 10 in languages that have a 5 base. The blue blobs are languages with a term for 10 that reflects Proto-Oceanic Pulu or Sangapulu 10. The red blobs are languages with a term reflecting Rua Lima, 2 times 5 for 10. Almost all languages with a reflex of Rua Lima are on Palma, Epi, Efate, and Eromango in Vanuatu in the north of New Caledonia, in Vanuatu and in the north of New Caledonia. This suggests, perhaps, that the source of Rua Lima in northern New Caledonia is somewhere in the central Vanuatu area. And this allows me to propose very tentatively that New Caledonia was populated from central Vanuatu. And please, the operative word is tentatively. However, the story will inevitably be more complicated than that, and we await genetic and archaeological findings from New Caledonia that will tell us more. Okay, what have I done by way of summary? Oops. I've introduced you briefly to the lexicon of Proto-Oceanic. I've shown that Proto-Oceanic has a decimal system with high powers of 10, probably used as ceremonial feasts for counting exchange goods, and that early Oceanic communities probably also used tallying of Papuan origin for everyday counting. The distribution of tally-based counting is odd. The New Guinea area and Vanuatu, but nowhere else in the Pacific. And I've offered an explanation for this that chimes in with recent archaeological findings, suggesting that tally-based systems in Vanuatu arrived with a second wave of immigration from New Guinea. Finally, I've suggested that New Caledonian numeral systems have an origin in central Vanuatu, and that this may cast a little light on the settlement of New Caledonia. Thank you.
Donc, merci pour la présentation. Est-ce que vous avez des questions dans la salle?
I was wondering, thank you for your survey and I mean detailed talk. I was wondering if you had conversations with Bob Lust following, you know, his paper, and is he revising? I mean, are you getting to an agreement with him regarding Papuan settlements?
Well, his last word on the subject in the literature says that he basically now thinks that there was a second wave of settlement. He thinks immediately after the first. The genetics, I believe, suggest 500 years, or something like that. Oh, sorry, thank you. Okay, Blust in his most recent statement on the subject says that in his view, there was a second wave of settlement immediately after the first, and that it came from a Melanesian source, presumably in New Britain. That puts him sort of reasonably close to what I think happened from should we say, a more detailed study, because he has a whole lot of pieces of evidence that he uses. I'm only referring to one piece of evidence, namely the numeral systems, which means that everything I've said is decidedly tentative. I mean, I think that what I've said linguistically, for example, about northern New Caledonia holds water because the sound correspondences work. But I'm basing all of my comments about history on something which is a single piece of evidence, and that, of course, needs to be backed up, as I said at the end, by archaeological and genetic evidence of various kinds. I'm sure the picture is a lot more complicated than the one that I've described. More than that, I can't say. As for whether I've actually talked to Bob about it, no, I haven't.
The picture in Vanuatu, as you showed, is that you don't have, of course, one single pattern in Vanuatu. You have essentially the decimal versus the, I mean, you have some conservative languages which have preserved numerals 1 to 10. That's roughly in the middle of Vanuatu. And then the north, and I think the central Vanuatu, would reflect the innovative 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay. Would you suggest that only these regions which have innovative quinary systems, quinary-like systems, would have, you know, descendants from the second wave of migration? Would you go as?
No, I wouldn't commit myself to that, because there's no particular reason why you shouldn't have a secondary migration and the survival of a decimal system. Russell, I see your hand.
Hi.
Microphone.
I'm not sure how to make it work. The button's there.
picture of a guy with a voice in front of him?
No, the little bit that's missing on top of it. Maybe I'll come. This one has
That one. Okay. So I thoroughly enjoyed the talk. One of the big differences between there's a big difference between the two genetics papers. Our one inferred that there wasn't a single second migration,
Agreed.
but rather an extended exchange between kind of Papuans and Vanuatu, whereas the Harvard one, which had less ancient DNA data, inferred a single migration. I think that's still an important point of debate between the two papers. If you look at not just the numeral systems, but at other kind of rare features like bilabial trills, we see that the distribution is quite kind of patchy, suggesting that these things didn't come as part of a single kind of package. I wonder if you have kind of comments about whether you think it was a single second wave or a series of interactions which produced those patchy distributions.
No, as I said at the end, I'm sure the pattern was repeated over and over again. I'm a bit suspicious of the bilabial trill thing, because the only bilabial trills in Papua New Guinea that I can think of are actually found in the Admiralty Islands. And that doesn't sound like a terribly probable source for migration to Vanuatu. I think that each of the indicators that we have of say, influence from New Guinea to Vanuatu needs separate investigation. I mean, all I've done is the numerals. And I think that a number of the other things that have been proposed, especially the things that Donoghue and Denham proposed in their paper, some of which I think are suspect, I think all of them need a fairly detailed on-the-ground investigation, and we simply don't have that yet. Sorry, Paul. Yeah.
Hello. Yes. Malcolm, in the volume that I contributed along with you, the aerial linguistics volume. I forget the name of the editor. Anyway.
Ray Hickey.
Sorry?
Ray Hickey.
Hickey, thank you very much. Yeah, I approached, that was one of the topics that I looked at was numerals, and I actually arrived at pretty much the same conclusion that you did. But I think there's other linguistic evidence that some features of non-Austronesian languages were incorporated into the Austronesian languages of Vanuatu. And offhand, I don't remember them all, but I mentioned a few. One of them that I mentioned was the accretion of the initial article, na, in nouns, which seems to be a feature of acquisition of formation of pigeons, like Lafette and Loto and things like that. And also the acquisition of initial e in verbs, which seems to be part of the same process. So, and then there's a few other things I mentioned in that same paper. So.
Good, thank you, because I confess I have yet to read the other contributions to that volume. It's sitting large, new and unused on my shelf at home,
a big
I'm
book.
afraid, yes. So I will go home and read it, thank you. But incidentally, so far as the accretion of nut is concerned, that interestingly also happens in New Britain. So it's New Britain and Vanuatu, yet again, yeah.
Just briefly, I was interested when you said Admiralties was probably not a source of migration. Does anybody have good, solid ideas about the possible source of that sort of so-called Papuan second migration? Would it come from the mainland of New Guinea, or
New Britain. The genetics suggests New Britain.
New Britain. Huh?
The ligature, if it did come from outside, the Lapi ligature is from New Britain. Paul's just indicated something else, the accretion of na, which would come from could come from New Britain. The trouble with all of these things is that they're not shared innovations in the standard technical sense. It's very difficult to rule out independent innovation. And as I said, everything I've offered is highly tentative, and I think we need stacks more evidence before we can be actually reasonably certain about New Britain as the source of features in Vanuatu. So let's wait and see. I can see the next speaker's getting ready to stand up, so.
Sorry, very quick terminological point. You call one system the tallying system, right? I'm not sure that's the best word for it. I mean, tally is just counting, isn't it? But also in what you call the decimal system, lima is obviously
a hand.
Cognate with the word for hand.
Yeah, I didn't talk about that. I do talk about it in the chapter that this is based on. But given that lima goes all the way back to Proto-Austronesian, I assume that was a much earlier round of digit tally system is the term I should be using. I was abbreviating it. But you're right. I mean, there must have been a digit tally system around in some sort of pre-Proto-Austronesian language, and I shudder to go back that far. And that's been retained. So, yes, you're right, and that confuses the issue in present-day languages to some extent.